Hello everyone, back with me again, Martiana Azzachra, and in this video I will be explaining furthermore. I actually have been conveying the information about the differences between children learning the first language and children learning second language on my posters, but I'm here to convey more and a more detailed information about that. So here we go. The first difference is children learning L1. For children learning L1, the basis for learning is universal grammar alone. Meanwhile, for children learning L2, knowledge of the first language also serves as a basis for learning the second language. For example, this is the example that I have written. So for example, this can be observed in any basic grammar lesson. Japanese students of English have difficulty pluralizing nouns, adding s to the end of the third person verbs, and putting the verb in its proper place in the sentence as it comes at the end in Japanese. So, though one can be aware of the distinction between languages and resist quick transfer of the L1 onto the L2, one still retains the L1 as the core guidelines for how languages and culture work. So another example is according to Spada and Lake Brown in their study in 1999, they found that native French children, even after hours of intensive study, still accepted ungrammatical forms of English as correct due to the similar sentence structure being correct in French. So this incorrect sentence in English, they thought of it, you know what, it's not incorrect, it's correct because in French it's correct. Therefore, the children learning L2 really rely on their first language. Move on to the second differences. So the second differences is first language learners always attain native proficiency unless they have a disability that affects language learning. Meanwhile, the second language learners are unlikely to attain native-like proficiency. So why and how? Why did we as a second language learners are unlikely to attain native-like proficiency? Because students, second language learners mostly and usually learn second language in a classroom setting, and these classroom settings usually provides fewer opportunities to learn language authentically, and therefore, and then additionally, L2 textbooks often teach language patterns that are rarely used in everyday conversation. So that's why we as second language learners are unlikely to attain native-like proficiency. And then the third differences are first language learners' children are given many chances to practice with native speakers, especially caregivers, because their family, their surroundings, their friends, their neighbors, everyone around them are native. Therefore, that it's very easy for them to practice with an actual English speakers. Meanwhile, second language learners may or may not have the opportunity to practice extensively with native speakers because it is very unlikely for us to suddenly come out the street and then meet tourists or like meet a native speaker, since we live in a non-native country. So therefore, it's very unlikely for us to suddenly come out the streets, come out of bed, and meet a native speaker to talk to. So that's why. Move on to the fourth differences. So for L1 learners, acquiring a first language happens naturally. So a child need not be motivated to acquire his or her first language because it happens naturally. They have to do it. They must do it. It just happens, it happens naturally. So they don't need to be motivated. They don't have someone to, you know what, you have to learn this because you have to. They don't have someone to talk like that to them because it happens naturally for them, for L1 learners. Meanwhile, another difficulty for L2 learners children, acquiring a second language often requires a conscious and a hard effort on the part of the learners. So, for example, I'm willing to be an example for this number. So I have to be motivated to learn this language. I am an English education program students, and sometimes people say things like, hey, learning English is very easy for you because you're an English student. You don't need to be motivated because it just happens naturally for you because you're an English student. You just have to learn it. It happens naturally for you. In reality, it's not like that. I have to motivate myself every day. Every time I wake up from sleep, I have to kind of like have a TED talk with myself. I have to motivate myself by saying things like, Tiana, come on, you have to do this because you want to be an important person in the future, so that's why you have to learn, you have to study hard. I have to motivate myself every day to learn English. When some people say that it happens naturally for you, no, it's not, because I am like you guys. I am a second language learner, so it took a lot of effort for me to learn this language. So therefore, I am the example of this context of acquiring second language often requires a conscious effort of the learner. Move on to the fifth differences. So the fifth differences are, in L1 learners, there are little variation in degree of success or route. Meanwhile, in L2 context, children learning L2 vary in overall success and route. So I wanted to explain a bit more about this context. So why are there little variation of degrees of success or route in L1 learners? Because learning L1 usually produce the same product every time, which is children with great pronunciation, great grammatical skill, great accent. Why? Because they learn from the best. They learn from the native itself. They learn every day. The learning comes naturally for them. The learning goes naturally for them because they learn from the best. Therefore, the product usually the same, which is children with great grammatical skill, great pronunciation, stuff like that. Meanwhile, for second language learners, there are a lot of variations in overall success and route. There's children with great grammatical skill but with decent pronunciation, and there is children with great pronunciation but with incorrect grammatical skill. So there are a lot of variations because we learn differently. So the learning comes with a different effort because we put out a different effort. Each individuals put out a different effort and they use different methods, they use different procedures. Therefore, the product of L1 of learning L2 usually different. There are a lot of variations. So the six differences in L1 context, children develop clear intuitions about correctness. Given even minimal input during critical pre-pubescent development, all humans acquire the L1 of the social or social group. They are born into a natural and essential part of their lives. So in Indonesia we call it kasarnya, even brain damaged children or disabled children usually acquire the full grammatical code of the language of their society or social group. Meanwhile, in L2 context, children learning L2 are often unable to form clear grammatical judgments. Many highly intelligent individuals with impressive learning skills, even that individual often have great problems learning an L2. So many L2 learners fossilize at some stage, so that even if they use the L2 regularly and are constantly exposed to that language, the L2 language, they still fail to develop full grammatical systems in the L2, in the second language. The seven differences are in L1 context. L1 acquisitions is generally triggered at the most critical stage of the child's development. So L1s are usually learned before puberty. So even if the children still 1 year old, or even like a 2 months old or a 3 months old baby, the parents already taught them English or the first language, because it happens naturally, like I said before. So L1s are learned before puberty, typically during infancy. So even babies in this context already being taught that the first language. Meanwhile, in L2 context, L2 learning is not generally triggered in any way unless the child grows up to be bilingual, in which case it's not really L2 learning at all. And usually, in most cases, L2s are learned usually often after puberty. So teenagers or even like adult, like me, 19 years old girl. Usually L2s learner are usually around teenagers or adults. Anyway, finally we come to the last differences of children learning L1 and learning L2. So in L1 context, children never resist L1 acquisition any more than they resist learning to walk. Like I said before, the learning happens naturally, so they don't really resist it, and they don't try to resist it, and they don't want to resist it, because it just happens naturally for them. Meanwhile, in L2 context, there is often great conscious or unconscious resistance to L2 learning, like have been mentioned and explained by me before. Children learning L2 needs a huge motivation for them to start learning L2, because it didn't happen naturally. They have to have motivation why they have to do that. So there are a lot of studies, but I choose these studies such as Maslow in 1970 have shown that encouraging intrinsic motivation leads to a higher classroom success rates. However, the fact remains that at schools, L2 education does not happen in a vacuum. So external pressures such as tests, grades, assignments, and stuff like that, and the desire to get into top colleges around the world are constantly in the back of students' minds. So sometimes, if they don't have enough motivation for them to start learning L2, children may show resistance to learn L2 because they don't have enough motivation to do that. So yeah, that's all the differences between children learning L1 and L2. I hope you enjoy it. I'm sorry if there are a lot of mistakes by me. I hope you understand it. Thank you so much for your attention.